In the years after the Six-Day War of 1967, the Israeli government opened up areas of Judea and Samaria, the historic heartland of ancient Israel, for Jewish settlement. One of the many townships established was Shiloh behind me. Shiloh was an important Jewish religious center in biblical times. In fact, it was the first capital of Israel, and the Ark of the Covenant rested right here for more than 3 centuries. These townships, some of which have a population of tens of thousands of people, like Ma'aleh Adumim and Har Hamar, on the outskirts of Jerusalem, are often referred to as settlements. The legitimacy of these so-called settlements has become a political hot potato. The question is, are they legal or not?
There's an interesting claim that was made a number of years ago by Eugene Rostow, and I think it's a very, very good point that he made. Eugene Rostow is the former dean of Yale Law School, but more importantly, he was Undersecretary of State in 1967 when the Security Council adopted Resolution 242. He addressed the question of whether Israel was entitled to direct Jews to settle in the West Bank and other areas that were once the Mandate of Palestine. And what he pointed out was that according to the mandate itself, the terms of the mandate, I believe it's Article 6, says that the mandatory authority was required, not permitted, but required to encourage close settlement of Jews on the land. That's the term that it uses. So what Rostow said was the right of Jews to live in this land is at least as good as that of any other population resident there, including the Palestinian Arabs. That's an important point to remember. Not only that international law doesn't forbid Jews from living there, it may in fact even require it.
If we actually look at the development in the West Bank, Jewish settlements have for the most part been established on public and waste ground and generally on top of barren hillsides, which wouldn't have been used anyhow without tremendous amount of public investment, which the Arabs have never even considered doing.
Prime Minister Netanyahu appointed me, together with 2 other senior jurists, to a national commission to examine the legal aspects of building in the settlements.
Dr. Alan Baker was Israel's ambassador to Canada. Now retired, he was an expert in international law at the Jerusalem Center for Public Affairs. He's been a senior legal advisor to the Israel Defense Forces and the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was a chief negotiator in the Oslo Accords and a co-author of the Levy report on the issue of land ownership in the West Bank.
Israel considers that its settlement activity is completely legitimate in accordance with international law, as long as it doesn't involve taking private land. Now, there are instances, and there have been quite a few recent instances, where local Palestinian landowners have claimed that their land has been taken. And there are legal processes to deal with this, which enable each side to produce the documentation necessary to prove that he or she, whether he's a Palestinian or Israeli, have a better claim to the land or purchase the land legally and can produce the documentation. There are ways of dealing with this. So in principle, the idea of settlement activity is completely legitimate.
Media coverage of the Middle East and even United Nations resolutions use terminology such as occupied Palestinian territory and the illegal occupation. Is this terminology based on international law, or is it simply anti-Israel propaganda?
The term Palestinian territories, or occupied Palestinian territories, or OPT, which is used in virtually every General Assembly resolution in the UN and in every statement by every major politician throughout Europe and British leaders, this expression has got absolutely no basis whatsoever. It's utter nonsense. So the only thing I can say that the term Palestinian territories is a political term that the political majority of those countries voting in favor of these resolutions has adopted it use it, and it's become lingua franca. Everybody uses it without thinking that it has absolutely no legal basis whatsoever.
Occupation is a funny word. It's one of these words that means one thing to people in ordinary conversation and another thing under the law, right? So when people think about occupation in ordinary conversation, what they mean is a regime that has no business being there, like the Nazis in France. Right? That's what they have in mind when they think about occupation. That's not the way international law looks at occupation. And this is generally well understood, except when it comes to Israel. Nonetheless, people have a habit of forgetting what the law says and substituting what they would like it to say for ideological reasons.
The Levy report concludes that Israel's presence in the West Bank, the so-called West Bank, is not an occupation. And I agree with the Levy report.
If you read the Hague regulations on belligerent occupation, what they say is that these are the rules that apply to enemy territory that is captured. Now, in the case of the West Bank of the Jordan, what was called Judea and Samaria before Jordan's occupation of that land, Israel has a superior claim to sovereignty than I think any plausible state in the world. And there simply is no precedent for claiming that international law requires applying the rules of belligerent occupation when one has a better claim to sovereignty of the land, even if it was captured in war.
Article 43 of the Hague Regulations states that the authority of the legitimate power, having in fact passed into the hands of the occupant, in this case, Israel is the legitimate power and the occupant. It says the latter, which could be either one in Israel's case, shall take all the measures in his power to restore and ensure, as far as possible, public order and safety, while respecting, unless absolutely prevented, the laws in force of the country. And that is their function there, to keep the peace, to keep public order and safety. And that's what they're doing.
Now, the international community have come along and say, yes, maybe, but according to the 1949 Geneva Convention, which was a convention adopted after the Second World War in order to solve the issues that arose during the Second World War, the mass transfer of population from an occupier into the occupied territory in order to change the demographic structure of the area is prohibited.
And unfortunately, this is another area where the popular imagination diverges from what the law actually says. There is actually no international treaty that talks about something called settlements. That's simply not an international law concept. That's a popular language concept. The international law concept is transfer.
Now, if you want to take, for example, the Gush Etzion block, which is just outside Jerusalem. Now, when Jordan occupied and annexed the West Bank in 1948-49, it ethnically cleansed the Gush Etzion block of the Jews. Those who were there were slaughtered when the Jordanians took control. So after 1967, when Israel took back control of the West Bank, the Jewish descendants of those families moved back to Gush Etzion, where they live today, and that community has grown. On what basis are they illegal? The only thing that could be illegal would be the transfer by the State of Israel of those people into the area. Well, the residents of Gush Etzion were never transported or transferred or deported by anybody, let alone their own government. They went there completely willingly.
This raises an interesting question. What is it all about? What is this transfer provision about? And there is actually a case about illegal transfers, but it predates the Geneva Conventions. It's a case that goes back to the Nuremberg Tribunal. And it had to do with German transfers. There's a German program that was called Germanification. Now today we would call this a program of ethnic cleansing and genocide. And so when you look at this program, it's clear that there was something there that was unlawful. It's not voluntary movement of peoples. What was unlawful was transferring parts of your population as part of a broader program of genocide. Now, I think it's obscene to claim or even to suggest that there's a program of genocide being carried out by Israel. I think it's offensive. I think it's bigoted.
I would argue that the Fourth Geneva Convention is probably not even applicable. But even if it were, even if it is, does it apply to Israeli settlements?
Occupation is a term about the law of war. It's a situation that arises in war. So if this legal situation came to be because of the war between Jordan and Israel, it would then end as a result of the peace treaty between Jordan and Israel. And here's a fundamental point. In no context around the world can you find a situation where anyone believes the laws of war or the laws of occupation, the Geneva Conventions, apply after a peace treaty has been signed. Peace treaty ends everything, because Geneva Convention and occupation, that's about war. Peace treaty, war's over. There is no occupation.
There's never been any legal commitment, legal document, treaty, agreement, contract, or formal binding resolution that's determined that the territories belong to the Palestinians, or that they're under Palestinian sovereignty, or that they're Palestinian.
In the next episode of Whose Land, we look at the Palestinian claim to East Jerusalem as the capital of the state of Palestine. What legal and historical basis does it have, if any?